The Manhattan skyline glittered like a kingdom of glass and steel as the city prepared to sleep. From the top floor of the tallest skyscraper, one man looked down at the empire he had built with his own hands. His name was Alexander Grant, and to the world, he was more than just a man, he was a legend. The newspapers called him the self-made titan, the youngest billionaire on Wall Street, and the CEO who never failed. But behind those polished headlines, behind the silk ties and the luxury penthouses, Alexander carried a silence that no one could hear. To his board members, he was unstoppable. To his employees, he was the visionary every startup founder dreamed of becoming. To the press, he was the face of American success, the immigrant boy who had nothing, who fought his way out of poverty, who built an empire worth billions. But to himself, late at night, staring at the glass of untouched whiskey on his mahogany desk, Alexander was simply alone. He had no family, no one to call at midnight, no child's laughter echoing in his hallways, no voice to whisper, "Daddy." And that was the wound he never showed the world. Alexander's story began far from the glimmering skyline. Born in a small Midwestern town, his father worked in a steel factory, and his mother took shifts at a diner. Life was tough, but Alexander was tougher. At 12, he was fixing neighbors' computers for pocket change. At 16, he was coding apps in his basement. By 22, he had already dropped out of college to build his first company. Investors laughed at him, banks refused to loan him money. Friends told him to play it safe. But Alexander had fire in his veins. He worked day and night, surviving on coffee and cold pizza, until finally, against all odds, he sold his first company for $50 million. That was just the beginning. By 30, he was running Grant Global Enterprises, a conglomerate spanning finance, technology, and real estate. Private jets, superyachts, presidential invitations, he had it all. But each time he returned to his penthouse, with marble floors and chandeliers worth more than most people's homes, he felt nothing. Because wealth can buy everything, except the warmth of family. At every press conference, Alexander wore the same flawless mask, a confident smile, a perfect suit, eyes that promised victory. Cameras adored him, stock markets trusted him, politicians wanted his endorsements, but his assistants whispered among themselves that the boss never laughed, not a real laugh. They said he worked 17 hours a day, not because he loved it, but because he had nowhere else to go. Behind his $10,000 watch ticked a man who desperately wished time could rewind. One autumn evening, while reviewing quarterly reports, Alexander's secretary brought him an unusual envelope. Unlike the sleek black folders of Wall Street, this one was white, with delicate handwriting across the front. It was an invitation, the wedding of an old college friend, the only man who had once believed in him when no one else did. Alexander rarely attended social events that weren't business-related, but something about the letter made him pause. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was loneliness. For the first time in years, he set aside his schedule and decided to attend. The wedding was simple but beautiful, an old countryside chapel filled with flowers and candlelight. Guests laughed, music played, and for once, Alexander felt the faint touch of warmth. And then he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, sitting quietly near the aisle. She wore a white dress, her hair tied in soft curls, her eyes wide and innocent. Unlike the other children who ran around chasing balloons, she sat silently, clutching a small teddy bear. For reasons he couldn't explain, Alexander's heart stopped. Something about her presence pulled him in. She looked at him, straight into his eyes, with a familiarity that shook him. And then she smiled. It wasn't just a smile. It was the kind of smile that pierced through the armor he had built over decades. Alexander Grant, the billionaire CEO who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, felt his throat tighten. For the first time in years, his eyes burned. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she looked at him that way. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt since childhood, a longing for connection. That night, as he sat in the back of the chapel, watching the ceremony unfold, Alexander's gaze kept drifting toward the little girl. She wasn't like the others. There was something quiet, almost mysterious, about her. And though he didn't know it yet, she would soon say the one word that would shatter his entire world. A word more valuable than billions. A word more powerful than any title. A word that would turn a ruthless CEO into a father. The word was simple. The word was eternal. The word was daddy. The wedding celebration grew livelier as the night unfolded. Laughter echoed across the decorated hall, music filled the air, and families danced under the glow of warm lights. Alexander sat at a table near the corner, his mind not on the champagne in front of him or the conversations around him, but on the little girl he had seen earlier. Every time he glanced across the room, she was there, holding her teddy bear close to her chest as though it was the only friend she had in the world. Something inside him felt drawn to her, a pull so strong that even the sound of 1,000 conversations could not distract him from her quiet presence. When the bride and groom made their way to greet the guests, Alexander shook hands, exchanged polite words, and smiled for photographs, but his eyes returned to the child again and again. Finally, curiosity overcame his usual reserve. After the speeches were done and the music softened, he found himself walking toward her. The girl looked up as he approached. Her eyes were wide, almost too mature for her age, as though she carried stories no 6-year-old should. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she simply stared at him as if she had been waiting. Alexander knelt down so they were eye level, his expensive suit brushing against the carpeted floor, an act that startled even him. For years he had towered above boardrooms, never lowering himself to anyone. Yet here he was, on his knees in front of a child he didn't know. "Hello," he said softly, unsure why his voice trembled. The girl blinked, hugged her teddy tighter, and whispered one word that almost made him collapse. "Daddy." The world froze. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all of it blurred into silence. For a man who had built billion-dollar companies, who had fought battles against competitors and politicians alike, there had never been a moment that disarmed him so completely. Alexander's chest tightened, his breath caught, and his vision blurred as hot tears welled in his eyes. He had not cried in 20 years. Not when his father died. Not when betrayal from partners nearly destroyed him. Not when nights of loneliness nearly broke him. Yet one word from this small girl broke through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. Guests turned their heads, some whispering, others gasping. Nobody had ever seen the powerful CEO in such a state. His shoulders shook, his hand trembled, and tears slid down his cheeks as the girl reached out with her tiny fingers and touched his face, as though wiping away pain she somehow understood. "Daddy," she repeated, firmer this time, as if claiming him, as if declaring to the entire room what she believed with all her heart. Alexander could not speak. His throat closed, his voice disappeared. He gathered her into his arms, clutching her so tightly it was as if he feared the world might steal her away. The scent of her hair, the warmth of her small body pressed against his chest, the sound of her heartbeat, it all felt like a piece of him he never knew was missing had finally been returned. Around them, guests exchanged puzzled looks. Some thought it was a mistake. Others whispered if perhaps Alexander had a secret past no one knew about. But in that moment, he did not care what the world thought. Money, power, titles, reputation, all of it meant nothing compared to the fragile weight of the little girl in his arms. For the rest of the evening, Alexander stayed near her. She refused to leave his side, and he didn't try to let her go. They sat together at a table, sharing silence, as though they had known each other forever. She fed him pieces of cake with her tiny hands, and he laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh, that stunned the people around them. It was the kind of laugh that came not from success, but from love. Later, when the wedding came to an end and families began to leave, the girl leaned her head against his chest and whispered again, "Don't go, Daddy." That night, as Alexander carried her out of the hall, people who had once seen him only as the ruthless billionaire now saw something different. They saw a man who, for the first time, looked complete. The man who had everything money could buy finally held the one thing it couldn't, a child's unconditional love. And though he didn't yet know the truth about who she was or why she had chosen him, Alexander felt in his heart that this was the moment his life truly began. Alexander did not sleep that night. The sound of the girl's voice replayed in his mind like a melody he had waited his entire life to hear. In the silence of his penthouse, surrounded by luxury and shadows, he sat on the edge of his bed holding the small teddy bear she had forgotten in his car. For years, he had measured his worth in net worth, in stock prices, in the size of contracts signed in boardrooms. Now, staring at that worn-out toy, he realized that everything he thought mattered was nothing compared to a single word spoken by a child. In the days that followed, he could not stop thinking about her. The way she smiled, the way her tiny fingers brushed away his tears, the way she had called him daddy as though it had always been his name. For the first time in years, he found himself leaving his office early, walking through city parks hoping to see families together, wondering what it would be like to push her on a swing or hold her hand across a busy street. His staff noticed the change. The once untouchable CEO now paused during meetings, staring out windows with a distant softness in his eyes. Some said he looked human for the first time. He began searching for answers. Who was she? Why did she call him daddy? Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The girl's mother, a kind but struggling woman, had once known Alexander during his early college years. They had drifted apart before his empire was built, but fate had left behind a secret Alexander had never been told. The child was his daughter, his blood, his heart. The discovery shook him more than any business deal ever could. He had spent a lifetime building wealth, power, and reputation, yet all along, the greatest treasure he could ever hope for had been out there waiting to call him by the title he never thought he would hear. He was a father, not just a CEO, not just a millionaire, a father. From that day forward, Alexander's life changed. The office that once consumed him no longer held the same importance. Deals could wait, stocks could rise and fall, but the mornings when his daughter ran into his arms screaming, "Daddy," were priceless. He traded late-night boardroom meetings for bedtime stories, stock market updates for laughter echoing through his penthouse. His assistants learned not to schedule anything during the hours he picked her up from school or when he sat in the front row at her recitals. The man who once walked alone into empty penthouses now came home to drawings taped on his refrigerator, to tiny shoes scattered across marble floors, to birthday parties that mattered more to him than billion-dollar contracts. For years, people had envied his wealth, his cars, his yachts. Now they envied something else, his joy. But it was not just about joy. It was about redemption. He had been ruthless in business, sometimes cold, sometimes merciless, because he believed survival required it. Now, with her hand in his, he discovered that the true definition of strength was not domination, but compassion. The markets began to see it too. His speeches shifted from numbers to values, from profits to people. His company thrived not only because of his mind but because of his heart. Investors called it the grand transformation. He called it fatherhood. Years later, when magazines interviewed him about his success, Alexander always gave the same answer. They asked how he built a global empire, how he became a billionaire CEO, how he outlasted competitors. He smiled, looked toward the little girl who had grown into a young woman, and said, "The day she called me daddy was the day I became the richest man alive." Money had made him powerful, but love had made him whole.